Well, welcome. I'm Bill Roach, the chair of the Environment Committee, and I'm here actually pinch hitting for Gene Durning, who will be joining us a little later. And I want to be able to introduce Ahren Stroming, who works at the Puget Sound Partnership, state agency coordinating the region's collective effort to restore Puget Sound. He acts as the agency's liaison to members of Congress and federal agencies and helps to manage the partnership's Mobilizing Fund initiative, which he seeks to identify and implement innovative funding and financing opportunities for critical restoration projects. Prior to joining the partnership, Ahren spent time in the Sightline Institute, and Mr. Durning is here tonight to see how he's doing. And he has a bachelor's degree in political environmental studies at Whitman College, a master's degree in environmental governance from the University of Freiburg. And his grandmother, of course, is our own Gene Durning. Tonight, Ahren will speak about the progress of environmental recovery in Puget Sound. Would you join me in welcoming Ahren?
Thank you. Good evening. I have some bad news and some good news. The bad news is that the Mariners are currently losing. The good news is that means that we're not missing them clinch the playoffs tonight. I also have some bad news and some good news. The bad news is that Puget Sound is not doing particularly well, but the good news is that we know what it needs to recover. So probably familiar to many of you since you're here living in the Puget Sound region today, but Puget Sound is a particularly special place. It encompasses the southern half of the Salish Sea, which obviously spans both sides of the American and Canadian border. You have a map here on the screen. Puget Sound is everything east of Cape Flattery, everything north of Shelton, and everything south of the Canadian border. That name is what we apply to it today. It's actually changed over time. When it was originally named Puget Sound, it was referring to everything south of Tacoma Narrows, and we've sort of expanded that definition. Tribal nations obviously have stewarded these waters and lands since time immemorial, fishing, hunting, cultivating, and gathering. Its snow-capped mountains and sparkling waters continue to attract people from around the world and businesses from around the world. It's also a complex ecosystem of rivers and forests, prairies, streams, farmlands, estuaries, beaches, cities, towns, ports, and roads. And a healthy and vibrant Puget Sound is essential to supporting our regional economy, meeting our obligation to tribal nations' treaty rights, and supporting our basic human need for connection to the natural world. I'll also say Puget Sound is a special place within the context of the United States because I think it's our last best hope for showing that functioning ecosystems can coexist with thriving economies. We've sort of blown that opportunity in other major waterways, Chesapeake Bay and Great Lakes, still both beautiful places, but are not intact ecosystems remotely compared to how they used to be. We still have the opportunity to preserve that for Puget Sound, but time is short. Looking ahead, we're currently about 5.3 million people in the Puget Sound region, that map that I showed on the previous slide. We're expecting that to grow to close to 7 million people by 2050. That's the equivalent of adding another 2 Seattles plus some more. We can meet that challenge with adequate planning and mitigation, but we need to make sure we're starting now. All of this, the challenge of adding more people, adding more businesses and development, is obviously complicated by increasing effects of climate change, including warming temperatures in the ocean and air, changing in precipitation patterns, and increased ocean acidification. So we've got our work cut out for us. So quickly, before we dive into all of that, a little bit more about me and the Puget Sound Partnership. The partnership is a state agency. My boss will be a cabinet member for the governor. We're a very small state agency and relatively unique among state agencies in that our geographic remit is not the whole state. It's just the region of Puget Sound. And we're a non-regulatory agency, so we don't have any power to enforce or compel people to get permits or fine them if they don't, or certainly throw them in jail or anything like that. So what we can do is we can align the work of many partners around a shared vision for what Puget Sound recovery looks like. We call that the Puget Sound Action Agenda. We can ensure smart investments towards that outcome through encouraging local, federal, state investments to promote the work of the action agenda. And then we can kind of track progress along the way. So tracking progress is most of what I wanted to talk to you all about tonight. And we'll, of course, save some time for questions at the end. The main way that the partnership as an agency tracks progress is through our Puget Sound vital signs, which are available at any time. If you Google Puget Sound vital signs, you can check out how Puget Sound is doing on a lot of different metrics. Like human health vital signs, they are meant to be indicators of overall health. And in our case, we're not actually exclusively looking at ecosystem health, though that's certainly a large chunk of it. When the state legislature created the Puget Sound Partnership in 2007, they said to restore Puget Sound, not only do you need thriving species and food webs and functioning habitat, you also need a vibrant human quality of life, and you need healthy human populations. And so they then left it to us to further define what they meant by that as we measure progress. So what we've built out is the vital signs to do that. I should also say, as we're going through this, as Bill mentioned at the top, I'm the federal policy lead, so I'm a policy guy. I don't have a science background per se, so some of the science is kind of at the top of my understanding level, but I will try to answer questions as best I can. So we track all of those vital signs all the time in real time, but every 2 years we publish a State of the Sound report that goes to the governor of the state and the state legislature. It's also available to anyone who wants to read it online. We are currently finalizing the 2025 draft. It's not yet actually submitted, so I don't have copies to share. So the most recent officially finalized document is 2023, but there's a lot of similarities between the two. So I've pulled kind of from both. The bottom line, though, is that the Puget Sound ecosystem is not doing well, but we still can restore it to health and make sure it can adapt to the pressures it faces. So you can see how we know it's not doing well. In those indicators we're tracking, only 6 are getting better, 6 are getting worse, and most are somewhere in between. So there are dozens and dozens of those. Well, there's 39 vital signs, and each of those vital signs has a lot of indicators underneath it. We would be here all night if we went one by one, and you would all be asleep. So instead, I decided to pick out a few kind of key examples that illustrate more broadly what you could find if you went through the Puget Sound vital signs. So I picked orcas, I picked beaches and marine vegetation, shellfish beds and outdoor activities. Those are a little bit of both the ecosystem side and the human health side. To talk about as we go through. I also picked those because we are in the process of identifying specific recovery goals for each of the indicators, and these ones all have specific recovery goals. Not all of them yet do, but that makes it a little bit more understandable in terms of where we are and where we're trying to go to. So let's start with orcas, our most iconic megafauna. I saw some actually several days ago on the ferry, not southern residents, but the transient orcas, which are doing quite well because there's lots of seals to eat. Southern resident orcas, which exclusively or almost exclusively eat fish, are not doing very well. We're currently at 75 individuals. That's not counting a new calf that was reported earlier this week, but we're try not to count the calves until they're a year old because the first year of life is very precarious, as I think you can all know. You all probably know from news coverage about extremely sad losses of those calves. So we're at 75 individuals right now. That's a significant decrease from where we were, certainly before white settlement, but even before the middle half of the 20th century, we believe there to have been between 2 and 250 southern resident killer whales in Puget Sound area. A combination of decreased prey availability and most acutely the roundup and in some cases killing of southern residents to be placed into marine parks really decimated the population in the 60s and 70s. But our goal is to move from 75 individuals to 110 individuals by 2050. That seems like a number that would be self-sustaining. Unfortunately, we are not making progress towards that goal. So you can see the various pods here along the bottom. We've mostly just been flatlining and decreasing. There's some concern that the genetic diversity that is left within the pods is not sufficient to maintain populations long term, but there's disagreement about that. So we're certainly not giving up, but we're kind of monitoring this closely because we are down from a high of when we were in kind of recent memory of 98 whales in 1998 to 75 today. So this is one of the indicators of Puget Sound health that is getting worse. This is not all going to be a downer, but I want to also be clear Puget Sound is not doing well. So a lot of this is hopefully galvanizing. So elsewhere in the ecosystem, in the farther down towards the primary producers end of the ecosystem, we have eelgrass. Eelgrass is submerged aquatic vegetation, seaweed, for lack of a better word. It is critical habitat both for juvenile salmon species as they're making their way out to sea, provides a lot of cover for them to make that journey, and critical habitat for forage fish, sand lance, Pacific herring, which are the species that salmon forage on when they're adults coming back through Puget Sound and when they're farther out in sea. So it's really important habitat. We want to increase that habitat for obvious reasons, therefore. But right now we're seeing that the sites that we're monitoring are declining in their overall area, outnumber the sites that are increasing. So our target is that by 2030, we don't want to see that trend line anymore. We want to kind of have bottomed out so we can improve. And then by 2050, we want to see sites with long-term increases in eelgrass significantly outnumbering declines. So here's where we are right now. This chart is a little bit science-y, I guess you might say, but pulled from some peer-reviewed papers looking at the status of eelgrass in Puget Sound. It compares long-term changes over recent changes, so changes that they're seeing year to year versus changes that are kind of more decade to decade. So at the top, it's the long-term, and then it's broken out by different regions in Puget Sound. The top SJS is the Strait of Juan de Fuca area. The middle one, NPS, is North Puget Sound, kind of think areas around the San Juans and Whidbey Island. And then Central Puget Sound and Hood Canal is at the bottom. So you can see that there is most of the sites have actually no discernible trend one way or another. That's the white bars. And in North Puget Sound, around the San Juans, around Whidbey Island, there's more increase than there is decrease. But that's not quite true in the Strait of Juan de Fuca and other areas. And so we have opted to give this one a mixed bag marker for this current state of the sound. We're not doing as well as we would have liked, but we're also not abjectly going the wrong direction. Okay. Moving along to other indicators that are less ecosystem focused, but more human well-being focused. Remember, to restore Puget Sound, the partnership believes that we need to have human well-being related to Puget Sound also be restored. So swimming beaches, one of the main and easiest and lowest barrier to entry ways that people can enjoy Puget Sound is go in and go swimming. Looking at the condition of saltwater beaches. So we have, I believe, about 40 or 50 different indicator beaches all around Puget Sound. Golden Gardens is probably the most famous one. Golden Gardens, Alki are probably the most famous ones in Seattle. And we want to make sure that those beaches are safe for people to swim in without getting bacterial infections from different bacteria, enterococcus and other GI tract infections that are not very pleasant. When those bacteria are found and measured, that means those beaches are typically closed to swimming, and that inhibits people from enjoying Puget Sound. And so, in addition to the obvious the health impacts, it kind of impedes that recreational impact. So currently, we are seeing that every summer between June and October, about 85% of beaches meet the safe standards for staying open and swimming. Our goal, starting in 2022 and every year thereafter, was for 95% of beaches to meet safe swimming standard conditions. Why not 100%? It's very difficult to totally eliminate these bacteria because they are naturally occurring, and fluctuations in the weather can make it more likely that they appear. So 95% is pretty darn good. Unfortunately, we're still not quite to 95%. So you can see we've been tracking this for 20 plus years now. We kind of reached highs in the right around 2019, 2020, where we were above 95%. Unfortunately, in the last few years, we've been decreasing. In 2024, the last year, we have full monitoring data for 84% of Puget Sound marine beaches had were reliably open for recreational use. And so we say that there's not really a discernible trend in this graph. Short term, certainly it looks like it's going the wrong direction, but because of that weather those fluctuations as a result of weather, we can't for certain say that this is as a result of the recovery efforts failing. So those were all kind of not the best, sadder stories, but I have one positive story for you. Shellfish beds. So this is both a indicator of ecosystem health, certainly, but it is also a huge industry for Puget Sound. Oysters and mussels and other aquaculture farming is a massive industry for Puget Sound. We wanted to see net gains of the acreage approved for shellfish harvesting every year increase by about 500 acres a year, starting in 2022 and moving into the future. That is because we were starting from a fairly degraded place. And so the target we were setting is let's build over time 500 acres a year. So we had one really, really bad year, as you can see, in 2011, when most of Samish Bay was downgraded to not be open to commercial shellfish harvesting. However, since that time, we've had year over year mostly net increases in the acreage of shellfish open for commercial harvest. So the 3-year average over the last 3 years is plus 217 acres. That's not quite hitting the target of 500 acres every year, but it's definitely getting better. It's moving in that right direction. And we're seeing positive signs that it will continue to move in that direction. So that's one that we've listed as getting better. So the key takeaways here are Puget Sound is in trouble. Iconic orca and salmon are at risk. We're losing habitat faster than we're gaining it. As a result, community health is being threatened. Tribal treaty obligations are not being met. And all of those challenges are being accentuated by climate change and population growth. So we need to have a plan that matches the scale and the urgency of those problems. And fortunately, I think we do, which is the action agenda for Puget Sound recovery. It is another product that we create every several years and deliver to the legislature and the governor, and is also available online. The Puget Sound Action Agenda does a few things. It charts the course that we want to head towards recovery on those vital signs, and therefore guides funding and policy decisions of lots of other state agencies, local governments, and federal governments. And then it helps us track progress towards those outcomes. I like to kind of say that we were doing the Paris climate model before the Paris climate model was a thing. We're asking people to talk about what they can do, see if it is enough, and then hold them accountable to make sure that they're doing it. So there are 37 strategies in the action agenda. There's over 100 different specific actions to be taken with assigned entities that are supposed to be leading on those actions. Again, I won't go into all of them, but I'll hit on 9 of kind of the thematic areas that we know are necessary to improve all of those vital signs. The first, and it's the first because it's probably the most important, is to prevent land conversion. If there's one thing to take away from this, it's that land in a natural state is much better for Puget Sound health and many things than land that has been converted to farmland, which is also better than land that's been converted to totally impervious surfaces for Puget Sound purposes. But preventing land conversion is the only way to recover Puget Sound. And so to that end, the Growth Management Act and urban growth areas are pretty crucial tools to preserving and protecting and restoring Puget Sound. So one of the things that we're tracking is growth inside of urban growth areas versus growth outside of urban growth areas, with the understanding that growth in urban growth areas is preserving the natural spaces outside, as was the initial intention of the Growth Management Act. So mostly that is happening. However, we're not totally to 100% yet, and we're seeing some decreases in recent years from highs in 2021 when 93% of new growth was happening inside of urban growth areas. So it's something that we're tracking. Conditions dramatically vary by county. There's another chart that I didn't end up showing, but King and some other counties in this area, every unit of housing added is adding very little impervious surface relative to other counties like Skagit, where every unit of housing being added is adding quite a bit of impervious surface, which is just another way of saying the same thing, that we need more housing units in places that are already developed and dense, rather than building out over green space that could or is habitat. Yeah, again, a lot of variation in counties, but we're trying to get to 100% inside the urban growth area. So then from there, once we've prevented land conversion, we need to protect and restore habitat. This is probably obvious, but most of Puget Sound critical habitat has been lost already. So we're going to need to undo that loss while protecting everything that still exists. There is some good news on this. That is that we are seeing increases in the acreages of estuary habitat that exists on the large rivers in Puget Sound, as significant investment from the state is going towards restoring those estuaries. There's a lot, or until recently, there was a lot of federal investment supporting those same things. So we have restored in the last decade or so about 15,000 acres of floodplains, estuaries, and riparian habitat. We are seeing a lot of progress there, and the progress is also being supported by the Climate Commitment Act, which the state legislature passed. Not only does a lot of great things to support a clean energy transition, but also supports climate adaptation, including preserving habitat. And so there is significant funding from that piece of legislation that goes towards protecting Puget Sound. So it was critical that it was preserved in the last election. We're concerned, though, that federal investment is going away. It's being rescinded. It's not being prioritized in the current administration. And so that might be an area where state and local and other entities need to step up and fill the gaps. Enhancing fish passage. Salmon are the other iconic species for Puget Sound recovery, partly because they're keystone species that are crucial for orca and kind of reflect overall ecosystem health, but also because we have treaty obligations to tribal nations to restore fish passage. that have been affirmed at the Supreme Court. So to do that, one of the key tools we have is opening up existing habitat that is otherwise blocked by culverts or dams or bridges. And we're doing that. So certainly you've seen kind of big stories about the Washington Department of Transportation, and maybe you've been stuck in traffic at various culvert sites. That's one element of that. That's kind of mandatory injunction spending, but there's a bunch of other fish passage projects underway. And you can see that over the last 3 years or so, we've opened up about 200 miles of new fish habitat in Puget Sound. There's some major opportunities that are also kind of right on the horizon. The biggest one is fish passage at the Howard Hansen Dam. Unfortunately, that funding was rescinded by the Trump administration. So we're finding ways that we can have that unfrozen and move forward, because that would open up about another 100 miles in one fell swoop of almost all Mount Rainier National Park already protected, excellent fish habitat. Action strategy number 4, preventing and removing invasive species. Not all non-native species in Puget Sound are having significant adverse impacts, which is good because there's many non-native species, but we can focus in on the ones that are. So one of the biggest culprits is on the screen here. It's a European green crab, native to Scandinavia and Northern Europe. It showed up on the east coast about 100 years ago, showed up in California maybe 40 years ago, and has been slowly making its way north. It likes to burrow in sandy, muddy, tidal estuary habitat. And when it does so, it uproots all of that eelgrass and destroys that habitat that juvenile fish rely on. It also grows, they don't get that big. They maybe get about this big, but they grow much more quickly than Dungeness crabs. And they eat baby Dungeness crabs when they are relatively small. And so we're having significant impacts on 2 major fisheries in Puget Sound as a result of this one invasive species. And so the state Department of Fish and Wildlife, tribes, federal agencies, all through working through the Washington State Invasive Species Council has been activated to respond. And there's been significant trapping efforts. Tens of thousands of these species of European green crabs have been trapped and eliminated. And it actually seems to be working. We're stemming the tide now when we're putting down traps throughout Puget Sound. We're not getting many green crabs, which is good, because it's kind of the story of invasive species is once they're here for good. And so being able to stem the tide before they gain foothold in Puget Sound will be crucial for protecting all of those other species that we care so much about. Longer term, we need to think creatively about how to limit their spread in other ways, because otherwise we'll kind of be trapping until the end of time, which is something we could do, but it's very intensive and you get muddy up to I went out once, you get very muddy working in the tidelands doing that. Action number 5, preventing and cleaning up toxic chemical pollution. So there's a lot of different sources of toxic chemical pollution. Certainly, one of the ones shown on the screen here are creosote pilings. There's hundreds and hundreds, thousands of creosote pilings all over Puget Sound that are slowly leaching kind of the toxic creosote into the water column and the sediment. Studies have shown that when forage fish, those herring and sand lance, when they spawn and they lay their eggs on creosote pilings, it's about a 98% mortality rate. So it functionally kills every single forage fish that tries to lay its egg, or the eggs of that forage fish do not survive if they're laid on creosote. Unfortunately, creosote is almost always found in the nearshore environment, which is the spawning habitat for those fish. So pulling out the creosote not only helps human health, because these are carcinogens and they kind of smell, but it will also help restore the food chain that salmon rely on, that orca rely on. So DNR's creosote removal team has been making significant progress, removing thousands of tons of creosote. The opening slide of this whole presentation was Commencement Bay. looking back towards Tacoma along Ruston Way. And one of the main features you could see in that picture was a bunch of creosote piles. The former Dickman lumber mill site, those were all pulled out in December as part of this effort to remove and clean up toxic pollution. Okay, action number 6, managing polluted runoff and wastewater. This is maybe obvious. If water anywhere in that whole map ends up polluted, it's going to end up in Puget Sound. So you probably have seen these Puget Sound starts here, indicators on drainage and stormwater drains around the city and around the sound, because it's definitely true. So we're making significant strides, though, to treat that stormwater. So the recent efforts by Seattle Public Utilities to build the catchment systems necessary to prevent combined overflows during storm events is really important, so that we're able to treat all the water before it ends up in Puget Sound. You may have also seen news stories in the last year or so about tire wear, particles from tires and cars. So the partnership funded a lot of that science to identify what it was initially it was just totally kind of unknown what was killing coho salmon. It was a really remarkable scientific kind of whodunit to track down among all of the different chemicals found on roadways, which chemical it was and what the source of that chemical was, and being able to isolate it as the 6-ppd quinone chemical, which is an additive in tires that prevents weathering, was remarkable. And so now the focus has shifted to how do we treat water coming off roadways to trap 6-ppd quinone so it doesn't end up in the water and kill coho, and how do we find alternatives in tires. So we have lots of different work in that space, both working with the tire industry, working with other states, funding research, also funding kind of economic, social research to understand what people might be willing to pay in terms of premiums on tires to have salmon safe tires. And there's a lot of exciting stuff happening there, and UW and WSU are huge partners in all of that work. So it's turned from something that was a huge and kind of scary mystery to something that we're on the cusp of solving, really, with additional investment. 7, reducing vessel impacts and oil spills. This is important for all Puget Sound species and everyone that doesn't like seeing oil spill covered beach, but it's particularly important for the southern resident killer whales, because at the number of individuals that currently exist, a significant oil spill could be an extinction event for those whales. If the whales were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and there was an oil spill there and they were killed, that's the end of the southern resident. So the probability is very low. The risk is very high. And so there's a number of investments and practices that we've been putting into place over the previous decade plus to decrease the likelihood of that. So we've seen now requirements for tug escorts on a lot of oil transport happening in the state. We've seen the stationing of an emergency rescue tug out at Nia Bay that can retrieve and assist impaired vessels that might otherwise run aground and spill oil. Those are that tug gets called out. You can go to the Department of Ecology's website and look at the Nia Bay rescue tug. It gets called out probably twice a month. Not every one of those incidents would have resulted in an oil spill, of course, but you can see it's having a significant impact, and it's all being paid for by the shipping industry, which pays into having that resource be available to all. We also know that there are non-oil spill impacts from vessel activity that can harm southern residents and lots of other things, noise being one of the key ones. Noise significantly affects whales' ability to communicate and therefore feed, because their communication is key to an animal that hunts in packs. And so we've established both mandatory distance zones, distance buffers. You must now at all times stay a quarter mile away from a whale, or 1,000 yards, I guess, is, I think, actually now the new law. from a southern resident whale. Most people don't know the difference on site between a southern resident and an orca, so that's just kind of a good rule of thumb. If there's any blackfin in the water, boats should be 1,000 yards away. If they're within that space, they should cut their engine and let the whales pass undisturbed. And then there's a number of other vessel impact things, like making sure we're cleaning up derelict vessels before they sink and cause further pollution harms, making sure that recreational vessels, especially in the San Juans, are using proper mooring so they're not dragging through eelgrass beds. We already talked about the importance of eelgrass beds earlier. And and then there's some voluntary efforts with large commercial ships related to noise pollution as well. The Quiet Sound program, which is something that the partnership supports financially and with our own participation, is a voluntary program that encourages and celebrates the large commercial ships passing up and down through Puget Sound for implementing a voluntary slowdown for the period of time when the whales are in the area. So as soon as whales are spotted, usually around this time of year, August to this time of year, that starts the slowdown, which usually runs through December, and it's kind of a voluntary speed limit that achieves remarkable compliance, something like 90% compliance from the commercial mariners. Okay. My plan was to use a picture of my own son here, but I just used one of our stock photos. Step number 8, foster human well-being. So I said from the beginning that human well-being is central to Puget Sound recovery in what the legislature tasked us with, what the partnership sees as its mission. People are a key cog in the Puget Sound ecosystem. We have a huge amount of responsibility and ability to protect and restore the environment. So part of that is interpersonal, making sure that marginalized communities can enjoy the same benefits of a healthy Puget Sound as wealthy communities do. It's about investing in equitable access to nature. In doing so, we're also building the political theory of the case, I suppose, is we're building more and more constituents of Puget Sound recovery. That becomes a virtuous cycle where more and more people feel a sense of place and stewardship, more opportunities for conservation-focused education, conservation jobs, technologies that develop to help address many of the problems we've already talked about today. And then kind of around all of this is the need to quickly mitigate and adapt to climate change. We're already feeling the effects of climate events. We're seeing significantly less snowpack. It's smoky out today. The snowpack that we do have does not last as long into the fall. As a result, we see salmon kind of gathering and waiting for longer and longer periods before fall rains raise stream levels enough that they can migrate upstream while they're milling about. They're easy picking for seals. So all of these things are connected. Certainly adapting to climate change is not something the partnership or any one person can do on their own. It's a complex and coordinated work locally, regionally, and internationally. So again, want to shout out the Climate Commitment Act as a huge piece of legislation that was reaffirmed, obviously, by the voters in 2024. That's been critical for supporting both climate mitigation and adaptation, and building in climate adaptation into local management plans helps communities start thinking about where they're putting their infrastructure and investment. So when you're in San Juan County or Island County or Jefferson County, where I am, understanding where sea level rise will take place and where we need to kind of defend against that, where there's a managed retreat that's appropriate. Thinking about all of those things proactively is going to be much cheaper than reacting to disasters. So, what can you do about it? Well, it's kind of a perpetual, irony that when I talk to my grandmother and my uncle about what Horizon House residents can do about environmental issues, mostly they're already doing all of the best things. They're living in a highly dense place where they don't need to rely on sprawling infrastructure to get around. They mostly don't need to drive very often. And they mostly vote in ways that are helpful for Puget Sound recovery already. But I will reify all of those things. It is really important. Those are the most important things for Puget Sound recovery, that we do not continue to convert land into developed impervious areas. It's very important that we have continued investment at the state and federal level in habitat restoration to restore what has already been lost. Those investments, we are already seeing them be slowed, stalled, or canceled outright by the majorities in Congress. So we'll leave it up to you to figure out how to vote to ensure that Puget Sound receives the investment it deserves. I'll also say that throughout all of this, implied in all of this, tribes are crucial partners and leaders and long-standing leaders in this space. And they have the legal rights to back it up and kind of put feet to the fire in a way that our non-regulatory state agency can't. So supporting tribal sovereignty and tribal treaty rights, projects that affirm and enhance those rights, will necessarily help support Puget Sound, because many of those treaty rights support the fishing rights and rights to gathering that necessitate a healthy ecosystem. Getting involved, there's lots of local recovery organizations, conservation districts have frequent restoration projects that need volunteers. There's marine stewardship councils for a lot of counties as well. There's a lot of citizen-based science. There's a lot of the trapping of green crabs is all done by volunteers, not all, but mostly done by volunteers. So if you can, or you can recommend or help support someone who can get out and participate in those projects, it's critical. I would stop short of saying, plant a tree. Certainly that's good, but we now are pretty good about knowing where we need trees for Puget Sound recovery, and it's really along key riparian corridors. So if you happen to be the landowner of one of those riparian corridors, please do plant trees, but otherwise maybe work with established organizations that are working on those projects already. Support density, advocate. I know most counties and municipalities are going through local comprehensive plan updates right now. The more density and urban infill and housing close to transit, the better. It's clear, so abundantly clear in the data for Puget Sound recovery that we need to accommodate 2.25 more Seattles, and we need to do it in the already developed areas. We can't pave over the established or currently functioning habitat. And obviously part of that is continue to use active and public transportation, so you're not using even EVs, which I drove part of the way here, is still releasing 6 ppd and other things into the sound. So the more active and public transportation you can use, the better. And with that, I think I can pause for questions, and I know there's some mics that Bill can run around. We'll start over here in this corner, and then opposite corner of the room.
I'm wondering why we're still calling it Puget Sound when the internationally agreed upon rule is called the Salish Sea. And you're clearly talking about the Salish Sea, not the waters south towards Seattle and Tacoma of the Juan de Fuca. So what's the justification?
Well, I mean, part of it's political. Our name in statute is the Puget Sound Partnership, so we continue to talk about it in terms of Puget Sound. But part of that is also, at the top I mentioned, that we do understand the connection in the ecosystem does not stop at the border. The Salish Sea, as you're alluding to, goes all the way up to Campbell River and slightly farther on Vancouver Island. We do work with Canadian partners. It's been a little bit more difficult in the last 9 months. But our remit as a state agency does limit our ability to tell Canadian partners what they should do. That said, we engage Canadian partners when we're talking about developing the action agenda, trying to make alignments in strategy. So, for example, the Quiet Sound initiative that I mentioned that we support has a comparable program that's run by the Port of Vancouver, and we've done a lot of information sharing. So informally, internally, we do talk about the Salish Sea. We understand it's the same ecosystem. It is the same ecosystem. Most of the fish that are swimming up through the Strait of Juan de Fuca are going to the Fraser River, not any of the rivers on this side of the border. And so there's close coordination, but it's still maybe a old school name.
The green invasive crab, are they fit for either animal or human consumption?
Good question. I think that, seagulls will eat them if they get the chance, but they mostly stay kind of burrowed in the mud, unlike a lot of our native crabs that kind of scurry along on the top of the sediment. So we're not seeing sufficient predation to make a dent on their numbers without being augmented through human trapping. I've heard some creative solutions. There's some folks in Maine that are making a whiskey infused with European green crab. There's another effort to turn kind of the shell biomass into disposable but compostable utensils. I think there's exploration there, but I don't think the economic viability is yet such that the private sector will kind of swoop in and take care of it itself. But there are some interesting ideas that are starting to percolate.
Is Victoria still dumping sewage into the Sound?
No, they now have a wastewater treatment site. Finally.
I want to know what they do with all the creosote spikes when they pull them out. How are they processed and where?
They're taken to a toxic materials dump site there's one in Eastern Washington and there's one in Idaho. And I don't actually know the process to ensure that is kept contained, but it's at a facility that's used to handling toxic materials like that. But it is a burden and a cost to transport it across the mountains.
What is the current status of shoreline, I'm over here, shoreline hardening, which is so important with respect to sea level rise, and we don't let the waters go in. And how are we doing on shoreline hardening? Well,
How are we doing is kind of a loaded question. We're doing very well if our goal is to harden all the shorelines. We have reduced the natural shoreline in Puget Sound wide to about 40% of the whole area in kind of particularly industrialized areas like Central Puget Sound, Seattle, Tacoma. It's less than 5% natural shoreline. So the shoreline is armored. It doesn't need to be to address concerns of sea level rise. There's a number of soft and natural solutions that a lot of people are working on. There's a program that we support that is run through the Department of Fish and Wildlife called Shore Friendly, that both kind of provides technical advice and low or no interest loans to homeowners that want to remove their armoring and either move their house back, or if that's not possible, kind of explore what natural soft sloped kind of beach grasses could work. The other thing I would say, because this is something I work on personally, is during the previous administration, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association took a pretty bold but kind of unheralded stand on shoreline armoring as it relates to critical habitat under the Endangered Species Act, and functionally said that the species that we've talked about a lot tonight, salmon and orca, are in jeopardy because of shoreline armoring. And therefore, anytime you want to not build new shoreline armoring, but just preserve the existing shoreline armoring, you need to offset that impact in some way. So working with a mitigation bank or not rebuilding the armoring or something like that. So that's a big step that's only starting to kind of bear fruit.
I've read several times that the programs to remove culvert barriers are removing the wrong ones and are not actually helping very much. Is that true? And is there a way to make it a smarter process?
Yeah, I mean, so the problem here is that there's parallel processes in place that are not always aligning, that generate some things that kind of make you cock your head and wonder what's going on. So on the one hand, you have the U.S. Supreme Court basically telling Washington State Department of Transportation that you need to remove all fish impeding culverts that you own. So they're working on that. They've been working on that. They have until 2030 to do that. They've made significant progress. And if you've driven around Puget Sound, you've seen them working on it. But not every road in Puget Sound region is a WashDOT road. And so that's where we have issues because there might be things downstream or upstream of a WashDOT road that is required to be fixed, where there isn't an obvious, I mean, there might be a responsible party, but there's not a funding source to fix the culvert. And so WashDOT's hands are tied because the Supreme Court said you have to fix that culvert that you own. But it's true that maybe upstream or downstream, there's a non-WashDOT culvert that will just kind of move the choke point somewhere else. Ultimately, we need to fix all of them. So it's still, in our opinion, valuable that WashDOT do this sooner rather than later because costs aren't going down to do any of it. And we need to fix the other culverts. When setting WashDOT aside, when the rest of the state and federal agencies get together and kind of prioritize culverts to remove, they do take into account what WashDOT is doing as new habitat being opened up. But it's not, even then, it's not always aligned that the best bang for the very limited restoration dollar buck is going to be right at that time where the WashDOT culvert is. The last thing I'll say is, and I can't say and I don't know anymore, the state and tribes are currently in an adjudication process about the fact that the state will not meet the 2030 deadline. And part of that is cost increases, but there's also recognition on both the part of the state and the tribes that significant investment needs to be made, but let's be smart about kind of this last chunk of it. So we are getting the most habitat opened up. And so I don't know where that adjudication will land, but it might offer some more flexibility.
You talked about eelgrass. There's been a lot of interest in kelp and its health, which is poor, and the role of starfish and the starfish wasting disease and so forth. Does the agency look at that issue?
Yes, in short. I was trying to find my kelp slide. So yes, that is another one of the indicators. It wasn't one of the ones I presented on for lack of time, but floating kelp is another indicator we track. We track it like eelgrass kind of in different marine areas to better understand where the problem is specifically. And as you can see, a lot of the Strait of Juan de Fuca and outer coast kelp is relatively healthy. As you get into more developed areas, we're seeing less and less kelp and more kelp decline. And so it is absolutely crucial, certainly, for habitat for a wide range of species. There's very initial research into reseeding kelp and replanting kelp, but we still don't have a really great understanding of where and why kelp does well. Some places that we think it should do well, it's not. And other places that it seems like it would struggle, it is doing okay. So we need more science into how to restore kelp, but kelp has both the habitat impacts and then the carbon sequestration benefits as well. And so it's definitely something we're tracking. Sea stars, I don't believe, is one of our indicators, mostly because, not exclusively, sea stars absolutely show up in Puget Sound, but they're more prevalent on the outer coast.
Since the orca southern group has decreased in numbers, could it be inbreeding that is causing some of the problems? And could they be, could you bring the bigs, the seal eaters, into and interbreed? Taking those questions in turn, it could be. There's disagreement among the kind of whale biologists in Puget Sound about the threshold below which the genetic diversity of southern residents would kind of create a long-term kind of doom loop where there's not sufficient diversity in the population left to maintain it over the long term. Some people think we're there or close to it. Other people don't. So it's possible, but it's not a scientific certainty that has happened yet. So we're keeping to work on it. The bigs, transient whales, and the southern residents haven't been documented interbreeding. I think it would be kind of one thing at a time. If it is indicated that there's no possibility of sufficient genetic diversity within the existing population, we could look at other options, but we're not there yet.
I'm a little bit of a nag on this, but who was Puget that we named Puget Sound after? Who was he?
Peter Puget. He was I don't know for certain, but he was a admiral or someone on George Vancouver's voyage. Maybe someone else can help me.
Yeah, he was a good friend of Vancouver's, and Vancouver wanted to honor him, and so he named it Peter Puget, but it ended up keep going.
Okay,
and that's part of the reason it was south of Tacoma Narrows, because that was kind of where Vancouver sent Peter Puget to explore what's down there, explore from the white explorer's perspective. So he got that section named after him, according to Vancouver, as the result.
we're at the end of the time we have, and I'm sure that Ahren will be available for some questions of each if you haven't had them answered. And I'd like to ask you to thank him for his wonderful presentation.